Hi, I'm Janina. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Janina, baby.
She's hopefully gonna settle down. This is Jasmine. She's a year old. Um, so I'm happy to be here. This is my first time at this meeting as well. But I didn't want to be redundant. I'm gonna get enough screen time. So I was born in a small town in Georgia. Hello, Georgia. Happy 4 years. Um, and I was born to an active alcoholic father and enabling mother. And it's been a long time since I've started back when I was born, but felt right. So I prayed beforehand, so this is what I'm going with. So the first 6 years of my life was under the reign of an active alcoholic father. And then I attended my first meeting at the age of 6 when I tagged along with my dad, who is still sober. So I, along with a few other alcoholic kids playing in the gravel parking lot, grew up with some familiarity to the program, but no comprehension. Really, the only thing I knew was that my eyes were so smoky after a meeting, like they were so red from all the smoke, and everybody gathered in a circle and like chanted something at the end. Now I know that to be a prayer at the end of the meeting. They also had like a wild wall that had like an island background, and people would stand at the podium and talk for a long, long time, and all these people would laugh, and I would not have any understanding whatsoever. It was what was so funny. But so that was my first introduction to AA. And as I got a little older, I stopped going to meetings with my dad. It didn't make sense anymore. He could no longer make his amends to my mom by taking one of the kids off her hands at night that way as I got older. But I noticed as I got older that, as I'm sure a lot of you have heard in the rooms, I hear this a lot. I'm no different. I never really felt like I belonged. I always felt other than. I think the best way to describe it is I always felt like I was too loud, too much. If somebody was like joking about like, your mama jokes or something, like as a kid, like I'd always be like, oh, I've got one. I killed your mom, and I'd be like, right, guys. And everybody, it's just like too far, too much. And that was definitely a theme of mine. Just never really feeling accepted, not getting it. Something else I've heard in the rooms a lot that I totally identify with is, I feel like I missed out the day they handed like the handbook to life out. There were certain concepts, a lot of them abstract, that I just didn't get. And as a result, like also, and I mean, I got to be real, like I relished in being an other. I didn't want to be like everyone else, even though it was painful, even though it was lonely. I kind of, I've reveled in that a little bit. And that wasn't always, it was kind of, looking back, like as a kid in middle school, elementary school, high school, there were varying levels of extremes, extreme loneliness or extremely, extroverted, whatever it was, I tended towards the extremes. And so I recall my first drink. I don't know what the terminology anyone likes to use here. I don't really know how this app works. I'm an old, so I didn't check it out beforehand. So I won't see it if you chatted at me or anything, Scout. But essentially, my first drink, I'll just leave it as the terminology of drink. But for me, there were other substances as well that I consider myself totally banned from. But I was 12 years old, and I'd been selected as one of 4 kids in my middle school to be in this institute program. This Cobb County was the county I grew up in. It's famous now in Atlanta for various sundry of horrible activities. Like, anyway, Cobb County Teen Institute. I was there to get to know other teens and help them stay off drugs. And I went to this camp in the beginning of the summer, and by the end of the summer, I had my first drink. That's how like elusive for me, you know, I was supposed to be like one of these peer leaders at that point in my young life. And that was, I was met with a group of people essentially that like, didn't seem to judge me in the ways that some of my peers did. You know, they didn't care that I didn't have like certain clothes on or that I seemed too much. Maybe they just drowned me out because they were drinking. I don't know, but I fit in for the first time, and taking that first drink was nasty. And what's really particularly peculiar is my first drink I actually didn't feel. I didn't experience any kind of drunk from it or even buzz. But there was such a little amount left over in the glass for me by the time it got passed to me that I just watched what everybody else was doing and did that. And honestly, that was kind of my first high, was really fitting in this way. And I actually had a lot of shame around that. You know, I don't consider it the first time that I felt the effects of alcohol, but it was the first time that I felt the social effects of being in that scene. And I kind of feel like, what's more alcoholic than faking that, you know? And I made a fool of myself that night, and I got a lot of attention, and that felt great. And then when I did have access to a drink, RC cola mixed with tequila, teenage drinking, I was off to the races. It was great. It was everything I wanted. I felt popular. I felt like I fit in, all those things that I fantasized about, that I wanted. I felt like I could obtain. And that didn't last very long. By the time I was 16, I had already dabbled in a number of other substances, because as a teenager, the hardest thing to get a hold of actually was alcohol. And, you know, when I was backing up a little bit, like when I was 14, I'd already reached like a pretty tough bottom, where, you know, some of the situations I'd already found myself in with this developing brain. So interesting being an adult and looking back, like I forget this stuff so much. I had a developing brain. I didn't know myself. I didn't have the opportunities that I've had now. And to live my life sober like I have, like the world was ending at every little crisis. And I had a lot of social crises because I put myself in bad situations. You know, I hung out with crowds that gossiped, that were vicious to each other. And I really thought I'd found the group that didn't do that, but no, it was no different. And it was pretty bad. And lots of physical fighting and lots of stealing and just, you know, sneaking out in the middle of the night and doing nothing good. A lot of shame about being like one of the only girls in the neighborhood, you know, like in the group. I used to carry that shame, but honestly, I was one of the kids in the neighborhood who was drinking and drugging along with the rest of them. So I've learned to put that shame down. And a woman doesn't mean that I'm necessarily to have been treated some of the ways that I was treated. But by the time I was 14, I hit a pretty strong emotional bottom while I'm drinking and drugging. And this still wasn't enough to take me out, but I did attempt suicide, and went to school so that after taking a bunch of Tylenol and aspirin, which are the only things I could get a hold of, had parents on lockdown. I was on like house arrest or grounded for most of my formative years. Because I always got caught. I feel like I hear so many stories in AA where everybody's like, I did this, I did that, and like I stole 3 cars or whatever. I always got caught. But I always thought that I was like a real badass, but I always got caught. But anyway, yeah, so I took all these pills and went to school because I really wanted for everybody to have to suffer along with me. But my body was awesome and just rejected the pills. And I ended up just staying in the hospital. But it was bad. It was bad. I had an underdeveloped brain and I was doing some real damage to it with substances, but I also just couldn't handle what was going on because I lacked basic coping tools. That was really rough to deal with. And I got myself in enough trouble where I was actually shipped off to a long-term facility for, it was supposed to be a 9 to 12 month program. And it was a state-run facility, all girls, next to the county jail and the YDC Youth Detention Center. So if you thought about trying to, like, the doors weren't locked, but if you left, you would just go next door to the YDC. And, the agreement was that I would become a ward of the state if I ran away or if I didn't finish the program. I had trouble with honesty. And what was really interesting about that is I was in there with I back up to be very clear. Like, I was sent there by my probation officer because I failed too many drug tests. I got away with it once and then I just kept trying and then I kept getting busted because, again, like, I just didn't seem to, it never sunk in. I felt like there were so many life lessons that just weren't sinking in. And so I was carted off to this program. And fortunately for me, they lived, ate, and breathed the big book there. There was also some talk about some religion. It may have been state run, but it was in Georgia. So, like, I was forced to go to church twice a week and stuff like that. But they had people that would bring meetings. And we would have big book studies. And there were counselors that were well-versed in the 12 steps. So my first experience of actually working the steps was within, like, an institutionalized setting. And that was really weird. But at the same time, when you're in a crystallized, like, environment like that, like, without outside distractions, I was able to learn some, like, key things about myself as a kid still. And that was pretty awesome. I couldn't, of course, see that at the time. I was 16. I was missing out on my junior year of high school. Not that I ever went to school, but, if I deigned to go. Most kids, I was in there with lots of different people with different afflictions other than alcoholism. And sometimes I'd get overlooked because my only issue was alcoholism. But some other people need a safe place. And so I learned, that was the first time I learned how I could hide a little bit in the program. I learned how to say some of the things that I knew made the counselors happy. But I didn't understand how to internalize it. I could intellectualize it really well. I couldn't necessarily internalize it. I got caught lying, like, when I was about 8 months in. I was just about to graduate the program and I had to stay an extra 9 months. So it took this alcoholic 17 and a half months to complete that program. I went back to my high school and I had been in such an institutionalized state for so long that in such an extreme environment that was good, but it was still extreme. It wasn't real life. It wasn't real world. That, I was scared straight for a while. And I took the suggestions that I was given, got a sponsor, got a home group. And I can't recall your name that was talking before the meeting, but my first service commitment was putting away the ashtrays. So that was just part of my sobriety in 1996. My first sobriety, back then my sobriety day was June 10th, 1996. AA's birthday, guys, June 10th. When I did relapse, I thought about waiting to come back in on June 10th again because I needed to coincide with AA's birthday. Fortunately, I didn't do that. I may not have made it back if I'd done that. But so I got a sponsor, I got a service commitment, I started going. I was the youngest person by a good 15, 20 years. It's this place called Rebos in Smyrna, Georgia, sober spelled backwards, which it took me way too long to figure that out. I didn't figure it out. Somebody told me. I was nervous, even though I had, like, all this clean time. I remember I would fidget in the meeting and, like, drink this crappy, basically grounds with water. Like, yes, it's coffee, but it was suspect. And I would rip up the styrofoam cup, like several of them during a meeting because I was just so nervous and it seemed so foreign. And my first sponsor, Roberta, she had a trailer and it had a fireplace in it. It was really nice. And I wanted what she had, which is why I chose her. She had independence and I still lived with my parents. I started working the steps with her and you know, she relapsed right after I did my fifth step with her. And I didn't really know what was going on. And I may have been a little self-centered. I actually thought she went out because of my fifth step. I promise you there was nothing that compelling in my fifth step. But I was ashamed in the program that I didn't have a sponsor anymore. So I just kept going to meetings and kept sharing about talking to my sponsor, but I was lying. And it wasn't long after that I made a decision. I didn't think it was all too wise for me to go in my senior year with my friends that I had reconnected with. Some of them, it was interesting because the friends that I reconnected with that had kind of dropped me in high school now were the ones that were partying. And they loved me because I was a designated driver. And I wasn't too keen on that, but I didn't fully comprehend what a resentment was. So I actually had all these resentments. It's very like Jim being mad in the book of like drinking whiskey and milk, like ending up relapsing on whiskey and milk because he actually was like in an irritated state. Like that was kind of me when I drove down with all my friends to spring break to Panama City. I lasted like 12 hours. I actually tried to go to a meeting. I called central office and I went the wrong way. I went the wrong way in the directions. Bye, Christy. And I saw the 3 months. That's so sweet. Happy little baby. Anyway, didn't make the meeting because I went in the wrong direction. A few hours later, I relapsed. I relapsed with somebody who was clearly in a blackout. And the character defect of pride actually kept me from going full wild that week because that was the first night. And I actually didn't pick up the rest of the trip because I had too much pride. I had already, see, you've got to understand, I'd already been there, done that. And these kids were just getting started. You know, when I got carted off to rehab, I was going to college parties as a, you know, as a 15, 16-year-old. And these kids were only partying with each other. No, thank you. It wasn't high class enough for me or something along those lines. Whatever it was, it saved my ass. When I got back to Georgia, I went to a meeting and I quietly picked up a white chip in my mind. I decided not to tell anyone. And I got a new sponsor. I started working the steps. And a year later, the guilt ate at me so much that I had to come clean. And I was coming up on, you know, publicly, I was coming up on 3 years. And was it 2? Frankly, it's hazy at this point. But I remember that when one day, April 7th of 1998, or 1999, you know, I was at a meeting and they said, does anybody have a year? And I raised my hand and picked up a white chip, or not white chip, but blue chip. And then tearfully confessed to the group that, you know, like actually I only had a year and I'm sorry that I betrayed everybody. I didn't check in with my sponsor or anything like that. I really still didn't understand how a sponsor's family relationship worked. And lo and behold, like nobody really seemed to care because it wasn't their sobriety, interestingly enough. But it was actually like, it was really wonderful. I thought I was going to get banned from AA. I thought they were going to throw me out. I thought this was an offense that was big enough. I'd held in the secret. I'd lied to everybody. And the only one that cared was my then sober boyfriend who was cheating on me. So he was lying to me too. So he was really deeply offended that I'd lied to him. But man, cheating in sobriety, that being the recipient of that was not fun in early sobriety, man. But so my true sobriety date is and still is April 7th, 1998. Since then, that was when I was 18. So 19 picked up a blue chip, 20, like 19 to 20 worked the steps with a sponsor, but still had this ability, this propensity for saying things or even quoting the big book in ways that I observed others getting like praise, and like old timers would nod their head, and people seemed a little popular with certain phrases. And so I adapted and adopted some of those phrases and adapted to that. And still couldn't internalize it. And like a couple of years later, I was about 20, 21. I got into a really, really low, like very low point in sobriety, where things just kept they ground to a halt. Like I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to drink. I didn't know how to drink anymore. And I didn't know how to fit in and be again. I felt that too much and too little. And I thought that my only alternative was really going to be death. And I just happened to be, by the grace of God, a friend called me and said, "How are you doing?" And I had enough like dramatic flair, I guess, at the moment, and honesty to tell the truth. And I said, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I feel like I want to die." And it wasn't being dramatic for once. It was, it felt very dramatic at the time, and it was a big confession. He picked me up. He took me to a women's meeting and said, "I'll pick you up like an hour after the women's meeting. You got to hang with them until then. You need to be around sober women." Because I'd kind of shied away from them, by the way, in the beginning. I didn't see much good for being with my own kind. And probably because I was hiding in the program. What's this vulnerable thing about? I didn't understand it. I truly, truly didn't comprehend it. And that is what I had so much shame about, really, is that I didn't comprehend some of the simplest concepts of the program. Step 2 drove me crazy for a very, very long time. Sure enough, I met another sponsor there, and I was willing to be honest enough that night to build and to eventually build a relationship with quite a few women. It took me on, I'm going to wrap this up. Of course, I spent too long in I don't know what, but took me to 6 years sober, moving to New York, which was absolutely beyond a small town Georgia girl, beyond my wildest dreams for sure. Moved to New York, spent 12 years there, almost drank the first year I was there because, oh my gosh, New York does it so different than Georgia. Doesn't New York AA know how to be sober? Oh, what's their deal? So I had to learn that like just how I was raised in AA doesn't mean that that's right. That there are actually many, many different paths and methods and different, meeting formats and vernacular that can keep people sober. That was truly humbling. New York AA was on my my 4-step for like many a year. But I did eventually get humbled. I didn't just get over the resentment. Like I got humbled and learned some amazing, amazing, amazing things from my friends and family in New York AA. Got a sponsor, met a man and got married in sobriety. I was never the type to have a relationship. Like I would always kind of, I wondered like, how do you do that? How do you get a relationship? People that like tell their stories and they're like, I got married and divorced, or I had this boyfriend, all that. Like I've never understood that. So I actually am married to another sober alcoholic. This is my second child. She's just a year old. She's passed out on me, which is awesome. I live in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia now, after leaving New York a couple of years ago to be closer to family, so I can learn how to like have a family. Again, transition back into Southern AA. It's a little different here. It's a different town. What I'm not saying, which I hope is between the lines and like in the unspoken parts, is that I've had the ability to work the steps several times. I've had quite a few different sponsors at this point, given locations, just moving and then also, learning what works, what doesn't. I've been a sponsor. I fired a sponsee one time because we were just better off friends. And I felt like I wasn't giving what I was supposed to. I've learned about boundaries in here. I've crossed many a boundary in the rooms. I've learned about getting outside help. I've learned about God. I've learned about the absence of God and exploring that and staying sober. And, questioning my faith. questioning, stepping outside of the realm of AA and looking into outside help, asking for help. Ooh, that's a big one. That's still kind of, I got to say though, like anything I've heard from a newcomer to an old timer, our stories are different because we're all unique, wonderful individuals, but the elements are still the same. It's very, very, the more simple that I can remember, the better off I am usually, which is trust God, clean house, help others. And boy, I feel like I rambled a little bit. I'm sure I went over time because I'm a talker, but thank you guys so much and have a wonderful night.